Videos like this are made possible by the generous support of patrons like Madzor. Thanks, Madzor. Hello, Penguinauts! I'm the Beardy Penguin, and welcome back to For All Kerbalkind. We're kicking off today's episode with another launch of our Strela launch vehicle, and we are sending Pogoda 11 into low Earth orbit. Yet another weather satellite that actually is a weather satellite, and not a spy satellite disguised as one. We don't get better spy satellite technology for another few nodes yet, so we're not going to be launching any new ones for a little while. And we're alternating these contracts with the commercial communication satellite contracts, since it takes 90 days for those contracts to actually reach their full reward. And these rockets are currently taking about 45 days to build, so we can alternate between them nicely. Now, in the last episode, we did a pretty dramatic dogleg maneuver to the south to get into the correct inclination, but I've since realized that these Svet satellite buses, which we are using the same ones for these Pogoda satellites, they have more than enough delta V to just do the inclination change once they're in orbit, and that is considerably easier to do, so that's what we're doing today. We're also changing the fuel we use on our satellites. We were using Caviar B, but now we've switched over to using UDMH and NTO, which is a little bit more accurate to what the Soviet Union actually used, as well as providing higher thrust and pretty comparable performance, as well as giving a cooler plume. Look at that. We had a little bit of a problem on launch. I accidentally left the throttle on full, so we burnt through all of our high-test peroxide on the second stage, so we didn't have anything to provide ullage for the engine, so we had to actually activate the RCS thrusters on the satellite bus itself early so we could provide ullage, settle the fuel at the bottom of the second stage, and fire the engine. So I had a small little panic attack, and then I remembered, we have other thrusters that use other fuels on the vehicle. Regardless, though, we managed to change our inclination and put ourselves into the desired orbit for the contract. Fast forwarding through to the end of the month, we're launching Venera 4, and this is a very ambitious mission to Venus. We're using a Yakko booster to do this because the Fikel wasn't quite able to do it, but the Yakko actually has more than enough capacity to do it. So much so that I thought I might as well expand the scope of the mission. I wanted to just send a lander to Venus, but we have so much spare capacity, I thought I might as well include a scientific orbiter and, well, a few more landers. Yes, we are sending a much larger and more capable low orbit spacecraft, so we can get all that juicy low orbit biome science from across Venus, because Venera 3 is currently in a highly eccentric orbit and isn't really getting much data or spending very long in the low orbit region around Venus. But we are also sending 3 landers. That's right, 3 in one mission, as you can see at the top of the rocket there. So this is going to pay for itself many, many times over, because we're completing 3 contracts. We have the Orbital Science Probe contract, the Atmospheric Probe contract, and then the Lander contract. And then we're going to get science from 3 separate biomes. And the US mission to Venus this month perhaps didn't go as planned. So it's looking very much like we may be the first to land a probe on another planet, which is extremely exciting. The first to return images from the surface of another planet as well. Now, I know some of you are going to be saying to me, well, technically, an atmospheric probe that the US sent to Venus did reach the surface, and, well, yes, but its antenna exploded before that, and so they will have lost telemetry long before it reached the surface, so nobody can actually know if it did reach the surface intact. So we're going to land the first operational probe on the surface of Venus, and as I said, return those first images, because really nothing captivates the public's imagination more than images of a planet's surface. You can take all the scientific readings you want, perhaps even more useful data for planetologists, but images are what get you funding from the powers that be. So, as you can see here, we're using our Block Day upper stage. It's becoming a bit of a standardized stage now, and this has had some slight modifications. We have extended the toroidal tank just a little bit, and this is actually a modification that carries over to all of our Block Day stages for the rest of this episode, and that's just so we can store a little bit more high test peroxide. Now we are using HTP on the lower stages. We're only using UDMH and NTO on the actual spacecraft because, well, we don't need the performance when it's just being used as RCS fuel, but when it's being used as the main fuel for the main thruster of a spacecraft, you really need the extra performance that UDMH and NTO gives you. Regardless, Block Day finishes its burn. We extend our solar panels. You can see we've got an extra solar panel on Block Day as well because it is going to be accompanying Venera 4 all the way to Venus and just providing a little bit of extra delta V. We don't technically need it, but it means we can put ourselves into a much lower orbit and we can get a bit more biome science when we arrive. You can see there the 3 probes stacked on top of the main satellite bus in all of their glory. But that won't be arriving for quite a while yet, not until the next episode. It will arrive before the end of 1964 though. Venus windows are actually pretty useful. Transfer times to Venus are much shorter than Mars, so the rewards we get from this mission will actually have an impact on the moon race because we are now in the final legs of the race to land the first Kerbals on the surface of the moon. The Americans are putting everything they've got into the Trinity program, and we are putting everything we have into our lunar program. However, we aren't the only nations shooting for the stars. At the end of March, we received word from Woomera in Australia that the Commonwealth Space Commission has launched a Skylark sounding rocket through the Kármán line. Technologies that could be developed into an orbital rocket later in the year. So not a particularly marvelous achievement, but considering they only began operations at the beginning of the year, that's quite impressive. It took us quite a bit longer, although they are starting, of course, with a much higher level of technology than we did. We had to develop it all from scratch back in 1951, so they don't even know they're born. Regardless, we are now launching Luna 20. And this is actually our last mission to the moon. We're going to be launching on a Feikal launch vehicle, and the last of these type of landers that land with airbags. This is only being launched because we have one more far side lunar lander contract, and although I was planning to improve the avionics on our sample return mission so they could return samples from the far side of the moon, I couldn't really get it to work. It just added far too much mass to the return canister, so in the end I just decided to settle for the last biome that is on that east side of the moon. I believe, is it referred to as the east side? I have no idea. The retrograde side, regardless. So we've got one more biome we can land in, which is what we're going to land in for the third and final sample return contract, instead of trying to get the far side contract and the last sample return contract in one. So we're just launching one more of these. Although we have modified it slightly to try and prevent that solar panel getting broken, because the last 2 probes we've landed have both smashed their solar panels upon landing. That's kind of the price you pay for landing with airbags rather than a soft landing. But it means that the probe barely weighs anything, and we're able to get away with doing it on this ridiculously cheap and fast to build launch vehicle. So we're skipping through most of this. You've seen this mission profile countless times before, so we're just sort of fast forwarding through to our arrival at the moon, and we're aiming for the Aitken Basin on the far side of the moon, which is a pretty large biome, so I'm fairly confident we can hit it, but I don't know the names of the particular craters on the far side. A lot of them were named by the Soviet Union, rightly so, because they took the first pictures, so obviously they got to name them. But you got a lot of pretty cool names like Gagarin Crater and the like. We're just landing in the Aitken Basin somewhere. It's quite hard to actually interpret maps of the far side of the moon and compare them up against your landing sites in game. It took a little while to figure out where we were actually landing in the last episode. Still though, as usual, we fire the RD-58, burn through most of the fuel in the upper stage, and then deploy our airbags and bounce across the surface until we slide to a stop. This never stops making me laugh, just how janky our landing profile is, but if it's stupid but it works, then it isn't stupid. Even though we won't have any more contracts to land these landers across the lunar surface, you might be wondering why we don't send more of them just for the science gain, but actually these landers will be made obsolete by the end of the episode because we are launching a lunar rover which will have all the same scientific instruments, will last much longer. These only last about 2 weeks, which isn't actually long enough to do all their scientific experiments, which is a bit of a shame. And also, a rover will be able to travel from biome to biome, so we won't have to keep sending more landers over and over again to explore the various different features of the lunar surface. Still, as a last lander, I think it works pretty well. We managed to deploy our solar panel, and for once, we haven't actually broken the probe, and it will last the full 2 weeks. Although it still won't be able to complete all of its scientific experiments. We'll have to save that for when our lunar rover, Lunokhod, has arrived. But in the meantime, we are unlocking lunar-rated power generation, which gives us solar panels for the early Salyut stations. But we're not going to be working on those for a while. We have a very long research queue, and we have more pressing priorities at the moment, like, well, landing Kerbals on the moon. The US crewed space program is definitely further ahead than ours right now because they have been operating a space station in low Earth orbit for a while now, but it's just it would set us back far too much to try and build one. It's going to be much faster just to try and build one after we've landed Kerbals on the moon. Unfortunately though, we have a launch failure on Svet 23. The RD0210 engine has an ignition failure, which is extremely rare considering these hypergolic engines usually have very high reliability, but we'll try again in a couple of months. And in the meantime, we get some more news from Venera in Australia, where the Commonwealth Space Commission has successfully tested the Black Knight, a test vehicle that sent a payload 3,000 kilometers downrange, demonstrating the United Kingdom's home-developed capability to build intercontinental ballistic missiles, and this will surely lead to an orbital launch later in the year. A little while later, we unlock large-scale avionics and advanced communications, which will enable missions to the outer planets of the solar system, but that won't be for a while yet because our build queue is currently full of N1 rockets because we don't want to waste any time in rushing to that lunar landing. We're also researching 72 to 75 Hydrolox engines and improved capsules for future upgrades to the N1, and we want to have the Soyuz 7KT variant before we send any missions to a Salyut station, as that's the low Earth orbit ferry Soyuz. In the meantime, we're launching Svet 24, and this one has a much more successful mission than Svet 23 did. The R100 is a reliable launch vehicle. We just had one failure, but I think that's going to be one anomaly out of very, very few. So now we've completed that mission, onto the highlight of today's episode. Yes, this is what you've been waiting for. We have finally constructed the first N1 booster. It's been years in the making, required an entirely new launch complex, and it is named the Slava, which was the most popular name for our moon missions, except for, well, Dave, which I did find very amusing. And the launch goes off without a hitch, which, I'm not going to lie, was quite a surprise considering how unreliable these NK-15 engines on Block A, the first stage, actually are. But that means we're already doing better than the first 3 test launches of the real N1. The first one had a fire shortly after liftoff, leading to the control system shutting down all the engines and it impacting the ground a few kilometers downrange. The second launch, there was an explosion in a turbopump a few seconds after launch, causing the control system to once again shut down all of the engines, and the rocket actually fell back onto the pad, creating one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history and wiping out the launch complex. The third launch had an uncontrolled roll that was started due to unexpected eddies around the first stage, leading to a breakup about 70 seconds into flight. And then the fourth and final test launch is something that we have just surpassed, wherein during a scheduled shutdown of the 6 core engines 90 seconds into flight to reduce the strain on the booster, a fire started and the booster was once again lost. Although the upper stages could have been salvaged if the ground controllers had reacted fast enough. But we have no such problems. In fact, we only have one in which one of the NK-15V engines on the second stage, or Block B, actually failed to ignite, but thankfully we're able to shut down the opposing engine and overburn the remaining engines just a little bit, and we don't actually have much of a loss in performance. Now, you can get a little glimpse of the payload that this first N1 is actually launching. We are sending an LK lander and 2 Lunokhod rovers to the surface. I thought we might as well make use of this test launch. After all, we're launching 90 tons into low Earth orbit. We might as well use that for a mission. Now, this is based upon plans that the Soviets actually had in reality, where a Lunokhod rover would find a suitable landing site and then they'd land a spare backup LK lander in case the one that the cosmonaut used to land somehow suffered damage or had an engine failure. So there's a backup LK on the surface waiting for the cosmonaut when they land, as well as a Lunokhod rover that would allow them to travel to it. So we're sort of combining all of that into one mission. We're sending an LK and 2 Lunokhods to the lunar surface. Now, one of the Lunokhods, Lunokhod 1, is going to be intended for scientific exploration. That's the one that's going to be completing our lunar rover contract and has all sorts of scientific instruments which are making our previous lunar probes entirely obsolete. The second rover has an external command seat and will allow our cosmonauts to travel across to the second LK fast enough to actually reach it before they suffocate, just in case there is any problem with the lander they actually use to touch down. If we have an engine failure, the LK does actually have a backup engine, and I'm thinking we'd probably use that to land. We'd probably just go for it, risk it, and land on the backup engine, because after all, you have to burn it for a lot longer to get back up into orbit. You might as well use it to touch down on the surface, then use the backup lander to head back up into orbit. Though the entire launch goes off without a hitch, which is quite surprising. I really was expecting something to go wrong on that launch, but this entire mission goes absolutely beautifully. I did decide on Slava for the name of the launch vehicle, although I didn't decide on that for the name of the actual lunar missions themselves. For that, my favorite was Rodina, which translates to motherland. I thought since Slava was the favorite of the comment section and it translates to glory, it was a suitable name for the booster though. I just thought Rodina fitted really, really well, and it turns out it's also the name of the lunar missions in Small Steps, Giant Leaps, the alternate history, which is apparently written by somebody on my Discord, which is pretty cool. Shout out to that. I haven't got around to reading it because I've been reading Eyes Turn Skyward recently, but I might actually do a video on Eyes Turn Skyward and some space alternate history stuff if you guys would be interested in that. Still, we're actually mimicking the descent profile of our actual Rodina lunar mission, wherein Block Day actually performs the descent down to the surface, and the LK only burns its engines for the last few hundred meters, although we do burn through a little bit more fuel than I would have liked because the LK is carrying a couple of tons worth of lunar rover on top of it, whereas obviously in the landing it will just be carrying a single cosmonaut. But we do, thankfully, manage to save enough propellant that it could be used as a backup LK, but it's got such slim delta V margins that, yeah, fingers crossed nothing will go wrong in the actual landing attempt. We actually have to launch 3 N1s before we can make our first attempt. Myself and N9 agreed that we had to do a certain number of prerequisite missions, so we couldn't just go insane and launch a lunar mission on the first launch of the moon rocket, which would have been absolutely bonkers. So we have to do an uncrewed test launch, although you see here we did actually send a useful mission to the moon, even though it didn't have crew on it. We then have to do a low Earth orbit test of the entire lunar stack, i.e. Apollo 9, and then do a lunar orbit mission, i.e. Apollo 8 or Apollo 10. But we managed to touch the LK down onto the surface, and we fire the 4 solid rocket motors that push it down into the surface, since it had such limited landing delta V that it could have landed on slopes up to 30 degrees incline. So it had to be able to press itself into the surface to stop any roll or, well, prevent it from tipping over and stranding the cosmonaut. It's certainly quite a strange looking craft, and it's had every single possible measure taken to reduce the weight, but we managed to deploy our multi-ton Lunokhod rovers without sacrificing the delta V necessary to reach orbit again. So you see, this is Lunokhod 1. It has a folding solar panel. I've learnt my lesson from smashing solar panels. And this is quite closely based off of the real Lunokhod rovers, although I think it is a little bit bigger, and the real Lunokhod didn't use treads, it did use wheels, but I didn't have wheels that looked quite accurate enough to the real Lunokhod, so I thought that these tracks looked a lot cooler. So then we can just ditch the avionics module that we needed to carry that extra tonnage and fly the LK uncrewed, and then it's just going to sit with those solar panels, extending its battery's life, so it should last for about a year, which is hopefully going to be when our first landing attempt will be made. But I've been making a concerted effort this episode not to show my build queues, because I don't want anybody looking at the amount of time it's going to take for us to build the various rockets and figure out how long it's going to take us to launch our first landing attempt and then compare that against N9's video. I want it to be a surprise. I want it to be a surprise who lands on the moon first, and at the moment things are pretty neck and neck. Still, we managed to send off Lunokhod 1 using the Bon Voyage mod, which is incredible, which actually allows the rover to move while it's not in focus, and it actually gets biome science from the different biomes that it moves through. So that's going to arrive at Rover Site Alpha, which is the site specified by our rover contract, within a few months' time. In the meantime, we are launching our final non-N1 rocket in our build queue. This is Luna 21. This is our final sample return mission. We have one more contract, and this was already half built by the time we had the technology to start building our N1, so I thought we might as well build this and launch it, get a little bit more funding just to speed up those build queues as much as possible. But this one goes off without a hitch, unlike the last sample return where we had some slimmer delta V margins than usual due to a third stage engine failure on the Yaker. But Luna 21 really is just a routine sample return at this point. You've seen them before, so we're going to cut through most of this mission. As I did hint at earlier in the episode, we aren't landing on the far side. I couldn't get the full control avionics to work. It just had far too slim delta V margins. Adding about a ton to the final stage of this mission really has an impact on things. Of course, you have to then make the sample return rocket way larger to be able to reach Earth again, and that means you have to make a lander larger and then the upper stage larger, and it just didn't really work. It went over the payload capabilities of the Yaker, but thankfully there is one more biome left on this retrograde side of the moon, which is the Midlands. We've landed in the lowlands, we've landed in the major craters, and now we just need to land in the Midlands. It's going to be a little bit more tricky. It's a bit more of a targeted landing site. The biome is a tiny little sliver in between our previous two landing sites, so we have to do this quite carefully and time it very delicately. But we do manage to begin our descent down to the Lunar Midlands. And actually, we have a little glance down and we see that Lunokhod 1 is passing by Luna 19, one of our previous landing sites. So with our successful touchdown, all that's left to do is take the surface sample and send the 80 grams of moon rocks back to the Earth. This is our last sample return. As I said, there's little more we can learn now without sending Kerbals, which we plan to do. In the next episode, you can look forward to the low Earth orbit test of the full lunar stack, launched on another N1, followed few months later by a lunar orbit test, i.e. Apollo 10, as I mentioned earlier. We are going to be taking an LK and doing a whole bunch of maneuvers, practicing the docking and, well, all the procedures we need to actually land, including the EVA for the cosmonauts to transfer from the Soyuz into the LK. We'll want to practice that one quite a bit, that's for sure. We don't want them letting go and flying off into deep space. And that should leave us pretty well prepared for a landing attempt. N9 and I have both agreed that we're going to do our landing attempts live. So we're going to stream the entire attempt. And we're going to try and hide the date. So we're not going to show Kerbal Alarm Clock or the space interview. So you won't know what date it is or who's landed first. We'll do the live stream, get the live reactions and everything. And then we'll have a full cinematic episode each for the landings. And then reveal who landed first. I think they're probably going to be within a month of each other. It's actually alarming just how close we are. August 6th, 1964. The Americans are right on our heels as they perform their first uncrewed test of the Katurn V moon rocket in preparation for crewed missions to come. So you can look forward to things heating up in the next few episodes, but that is the end of this one. If you want to see what the Americans and what the Commonwealth Space Commission, what the United Kerbdom have been doing under Carnasa's leadership, you can check out links in the description and the end screen. N9 and Carnasa both went a little further into 1964 than me. They went into October, I believe. We haven't gone quite that far because we had a lot of stuff to do, particularly with the first launch of the N1, but we'll be catching back up to them in the next episode. Thank you very much for watching, everyone. I've been the Bitty Penguin, and I'll see you all next time. A massive thank you to my patrons and donators for their generous support, and an extra special thank you to the Amazing Steak, Olaf Hammerhand, Lady Lagsalot, Dakota Clark, Madzor, Peter Lushtinets, Dennis Klomp, Lightning Gamer, Simone67, Scott Milligan, Jesse Smith, Elmac, and NX74656.